Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1: A Quiet Disturbance. It was a crisp morning in London, the kind where the fog hangs lightly over the Thames, softening the outlines of the city, and where the echo of horse-drawn cabs mingles with the distant clatter of street vendors. Hercule Poirot was enjoying his usual tranquility at his lodgings in Belgravia, seated at a polished mahogany table with a small cup of espresso, when a letter arrived that would soon disturb the serenity of his morning. The envelope was of fine parchment, its edges carefully trimmed, sealed with a deep crimson wax stamp, and addressed in a graceful, almost trembling hand. Poirot, whose eyes missed nothing, immediately noted these details. "Ah, Hastings," he said, gesturing to his friend who sat nearby, reading the morning paper, "observe. The letter is not merely a communication, it is a declaration of emotion, even a subtle cry for help. And it comes from a lady of discernment. This is no trivial matter." Captain Hastings, a man of good heart but more accustomed to physical adventures than cerebral intrigue, glanced at the envelope with mild curiosity. "Well, it seems urgent enough," he replied, folding the paper slowly. "Shall I open it for you?" Poirot's moustache twitched with a faint smile. "Mais non, mon ami. One must always handle the documents of a lady with the utmost respect. The act of opening the envelope is itself a ritual. Attention to small details, Hastings, is what separates the ordinary from the extraordinary. Observe the wax, the texture of the parchment, the ink. One can deduce much before even reading a single word." With delicate precision, Poirot broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting, elegant and refined, belonged unmistakably to someone of education and status. It read, "Dear Monsieur Poirot, I am in great distress and fear for the security of my possessions. Though nothing appears to have been taken, I am certain a theft has occurred at my estate. I humbly beg for your assistance at the earliest possible convenience. Yours sincerely, Evelyn Hawthorne." Poirot raised an eyebrow, considering the phrasing. "Note, Hastings," he said, pointing to the words with a slender finger, "she insists nothing appears missing, and yet she fears theft. How fascinating! The lady's intuition tells her that an act of mischief or crime has occurred, though the evidence is hidden, invisible. Ah, the mind of the criminal and the mind of the observant detective, both are delicate instruments, requiring finesse." Hastings frowned slightly. "Invisible theft? I don't understand, Poirot. How can someone steal something without it being gone?" "That, mon ami, is precisely the question," Poirot replied, his dark eyes twinkling with interest. "It is not always the act itself which matters, but the intention behind it. An intention leaves traces, subtle, often imperceptible traces. Ah, I feel that this case will exercise our little grey cells more than usual." By mid-morning, Poirot and Hastings had arranged for a carriage to take them to the Hawthorne estate, located in the quiet outskirts of London. The journey was smooth, the street still damp from an early drizzle, reflecting the muted light of a sun struggling to rise fully over the horizon. Poirot, seated upright with his legs crossed and hands clasped on his lap, observed every detail. The carriage driver's uniform, polished yet slightly creased, the horse's hooves, tracing rhythmic patterns along the cobblestones, even the slight tremor in a shopkeeper's hands as he carried a basket of apples. Nothing escaped the detective's attention. Upon arriving, the carriage rolled through the gates of the estate, which were of wrought iron, elaborately curved, and painted a deep green that had begun to weather in patches. The mansion itself was an impressive structure, a blend of Elizabethan grandeur with modern refinements. Stone carvings of cherubs and floral motifs adorned the facade, and large bay windows reflected the early light. The gardens, though trimmed with precision, seemed to harbour quiet secrets among their hedges and flower beds. Lady Evelyn Hawthorne greeted them at the door. She was a woman of striking presence, not merely because of her refined features, but due to an aura of poised elegance mingled with evident distress. Her dress was tasteful and subdued in tone, yet the faint quiver in her hands betrayed her agitation. Poirot observed this with keen interest. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, inclining her head gracefully. "Thank you for coming so promptly. I fear I may be overreacting, but I am certain that something is amiss." Poirot offered his customary bow. "Madam, one never overreacts when the little grey cells are troubled. Your intuition is rarely mistaken, n'est-ce pas? Now, tell me, what exactly has disturbed your peace?" Lady Evelyn led them into a sunlit sitting room adorned with tapestries, rare books, and an assortment of fine paintings. A delicate fragrance of lavender and old paper filled the air. She gestured toward a cabinet displaying a collection of miniature paintings and small antiquities. "It was during my recent inventory," she explained, "that I noticed something strange. One of the miniatures, this one, a portrait by a Victorian artist, seems altered. Not stolen, not damaged, but somehow wrong. Perhaps it is my imagination. But then, there are other small inconsistencies I cannot explain. I cannot sleep, knowing that someone has been in my home, touching my possessions without my knowledge." Poirot stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. He examined the painting, its delicate brushwork, the subtle play of light and shadow, the precise manner in which it was framed. He ran a finger lightly along the edge of the frame, noting a faint indentation that suggested it had been handled, perhaps removed and replaced. "Ah, Hastings, note," Poirot murmured softly, "even when no overt evidence presents itself, the truth whispers through the smallest details. A painting slightly shifted, a frame imperceptibly marked, mon Dieu. There is much to investigate here, and we have barely begun." Lady Evelyn watched him with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "You believe me, then, Monsieur Poirot? That someone may indeed have been here?" "Mais oui, madam. But let us not act on suspicion alone. We must observe, deduce, and understand the mind behind this invisible crime. Only then can the invisible become visible." Hastings, though puzzled, could not help but feel a thrill of anticipation. There was a strange charm in Poirot's calm, confident approach, the way he seemed to unravel mysteries not with force or haste, but with patience, subtlety, and the power of observation. Poirot turned his attention to the other objects in the room, his eye scanning every vase, every piece of silverware, every book. "Notice, Hastings," he whispered, "how even the most minor objects may betray secrets. The criminal believes in concealment, but he underestimates the power of meticulous observation. Herein lies our advantage." Lady Evelyn led them upstairs, showing them the rooms where the other miniatures and small treasures were kept. Poirot's gaze was sharp, taking in each detail, the slight wear on the floorboards, the faint scuff marks near the cabinet, even the positioning of the rugs, which suggested frequent shifting by a careful hand. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the estate, Poirot retired to the sitting room, motioning for Hastings to join him. "Mon ami," he said, stroking his moustache thoughtfully, "we have before us a mystery delicate as a spider's web. It is not bold or brazen, but subtle, insidious, and invisible to the untrained eye. Yet I can feel the rhythm of it, the presence of a mind that believes itself clever, but which cannot outwit mine." Hastings sighed, half in admiration, half in exasperation. "Invisible theft, Poirot. You always find a way to make the impossible seem inevitable." Poirot smiled serenely. "Ah, Hastings, the impossible is merely the unexamined. Now, we must observe, we must question, and we must wait. For the criminal, though cunning, will reveal himself, not in bold gestures, but in the smallest betrayals of character. And when he does, the little grey cells will be ready. Thus began the investigation of the invisible theft at Hawthorne estate, a case that promised to challenge Poirot's unmatched powers of observation, deduction, and understanding of the human mind. In that quiet, sunlit room, surrounded by treasures both precious and subtle, the detective's little grey cells began their delicate work, weaving together threads that only he could perceive, ready to unravel the secrets hidden in plain sight. Chapter 2: The House of Subtleties. The following morning dawned over the Hawthorne estate with a pale, hesitant light. The fog had lifted, leaving a crisp chill in the air that seemed to sharpen every detail of the sprawling grounds. Hercule Poirot, ever the observer, rose early, insisting on a solitary inspection of the estate before the household had fully awakened. Hastings followed obediently, though with less enthusiasm, wrapped in his overcoat and muttering about the unseasonable chill. The front entrance alone provided a world of subtle clues. Poirot's keen eyes swept over the cobblestones, noting footprints faintly imprinted in the residual dampness from the previous night. They were mostly from the household staff, delicate shoe prints from the housekeeper, heavier boots from the butler, but Poirot paused at a slightly shallower indentation near the side of the steps. "Observe, Hastings," he whispered, pointing with a gloved hand. "Someone has stepped here, but not carelessly. Notice the absence of drag marks. It is the work of one who moves with intention, aware of each step. Not the erratic tread of a visitor, Ms. UN expert in stealth." Hastings squinted at the ground. "You think someone has been sneaking around outside before anyone else was awake?" "Exactament," Poirot replied. "And that is the beginning. One must always consider the external before moving to the internal. Every crime, mean the most invisible, leaves a trace in the environment before it leaves a trace on the conscience of the guilty." Once inside, Poirot began his methodical survey of the rooms where Lady Evelyn's treasures were kept. He examined each miniature painting, each trinket, every piece of furniture, not merely with his eyes but with the practiced scrutiny of touch. A faint smudge on a polished wooden surface here, the subtle shift of a rug there, each anomaly was catalogued mentally, an invisible ledger of suspicion. The cabinet containing the miniature painting that had first troubled Lady Evelyn drew Poirot's attention again. He circled it, tapping the edge lightly with a knuckle, listening to the hollow sound of the wood. "Notice, Hastings," he murmured, "the sound is not uniform. That is because the construction, though solid, has a mechanism built into the rear panel. Someone has exploited this. It is ingenious, invisible to the untrained eye, but my friend, I see." Hastings, still struggling to comprehend, scratched his head. "A mechanism? You mean like a secret compartment?" "Ms. OUI. But subtle, so subtle that the lady herself did not notice at first. And therein lies the cleverness of the thief, the belief that if nothing appears taken, no suspicion will arise. But that, Hastings, is where the little grey cells prevail." Poirot then turned his attention to the household staff, questioning each member with a delicate precision. Mr. Chalmers, the butler, was impeccable in manner, answering questions with politeness, though Poirot noted a slight tightening of the jaw when asked about the movement of the cabinet. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, was nervous, her hands trembling as she recounted her duties, insisting she had seen nothing unusual. Yet Poirot noticed a tiny stain of wax on her apron, a detail she seemed unaware of. "Curious," Poirot murmured. "One must never dismiss the unnoticed, Hastings. Sometimes the smallest mark reveals the greatest truths." Next, Poirot examined the more intimate spaces of the estate, the library, where Lady Evelyn spent her afternoons, and the drawing room, adorned with tapestries and gilded mirrors. He observed the position of furniture, the alignment of books on shelves, and the way the sunlight fell across the floors. It seemed ordinary to Hastings, but Poirot perceived the subtleties, a chair slightly out of place, a book lying at an unusual angle, a faint scratch on a table edge. Each anomaly told a story, though one invisible to the casual observer. As he walked, Poirot paused near a window, noting the faint residue of a fingerprint on the brass handle. "Hastings, observe here. The mark is nearly imperceptible. One would miss it entirely. But notice the angle, the pressure, the minutiae of how it was left. These are not careless hands, they are precise, deliberate. The thief is confident, and yet, always betrays himself in the smallest detail." While Poirot continued his meticulous survey, Hastings found his attention drawn elsewhere, to the gardens, which stretched elegantly around the estate. He noted the well-trimmed hedges, the neat gravel paths, and the ornate fountains. "I don't see how this helps, Poirot," Hastings muttered, returning inside. "The thief must be someone inside the house, surely." Poirot smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Ah, Hastings, one must consider all possibilities. The thief may have been both inside and outside, moving like a shadow between rooms and corridors. That is why observation of the surroundings is essential. The criminal, even in hiding, leaves footprints, not only of the feet but of intention." By midday, Poirot had begun piecing together a mental map of movement within the estate. He noted which rooms were easily accessible, which had been locked and undisturbed, and which contained the most valuable objects. Yet, even as he catalogued these details, he remained aware of a curious psychological element, the subtle tension among the household. Mrs. Fenwick's nervous glances, the butler's rigid posture, the faint impatience in Lady Evelyn's voice, all were threads in a web that Poirot intended to unravel. "Tell me, Hastings," Poirot asked, tilting his head thoughtfully, "do you notice how a house itself can speak? These walls, these floors, these objects, they tell us what is hidden, if only we know how to listen. One must not rely on statements alone, nor appearances. Observe the expressions, the gestures, the minor inconsistencies. That is where truth resides." Hastings, now following Poirot like a devoted apprentice, nodded slowly. "So, we are looking for tiny clues, little things that seem unimportant but actually aren't." "Exactment. The criminal believes in invisibility, but the observant mind sees all. One must think like the thief while never becoming the thief. And Hastings, mark my words, the person responsible is clever, but cleverness without caution is revealed by the minutest slip." Poirot then moved toward a side cabinet containing an assortment of silverware and small objets d'art. He tapped lightly on the edges, his ears attuned to the subtle differences in sound. The faintest hollow note indicated a small drawer had been disturbed recently. He examined the edges with a magnifying glass, noting the almost imperceptible wear, too uniform to be accidental, yet too subtle to draw attention. "Ah, mon ami," he said to Hastings, a hint of excitement in his voice, "the evidence is invisible, but it exists. One merely must train the eye to see the invisible, and the mind to interpret the silent testimony of objects." After several hours, Poirot concluded his initial inspection and gathered Hastings and Lady Evelyn in the sitting room. "Madam," he began, gracefully bowing, "your instincts are correct. There has indeed been activity that should not have occurred. Nothing was forcibly taken, yet someone has handled your possessions, moved objects, and created what one might call an invisible theft. The question now is why, and by whom?" Lady Evelyn, though visibly relieved that Poirot confirmed her suspicions, still appeared anxious. "But how can one find a thief when nothing is gone? How can one prove it?" Poirot tapped his moustache thoughtfully. "Ah, madam, one does not always need to prove the act immediately. One observes, one listens, and one waits. The criminal, confident in his cleverness, will soon reveal himself, not by brazen gestures, but by his own misjudgments. Our task is to recognize them, subtle as they may be." Hastings, exhausted but fascinated, sank into an armchair. "I must say, Poirot, I've never seen a crime investigated like this. It's all so delicate, like defusing a bomb with gloves on." Poirot smiled, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Ah, Hastings, the mind is a far more delicate instrument than any device of steel. And it is the mind that we must diffuse. Observe, deduce, interpret, and in time, the invisible will be revealed, and justice, subtle but certain, will prevail." As the afternoon waned and the light softened, Poirot retreated to the window, gazing out over the gardens with a contemplative expression. The estate was peaceful, almost serene, yet he knew that beneath the calm surface lurked hidden truths, tiny manipulations, and secrets waiting to be uncovered. The house itself, in its silence, whispered to him, its walls, floors, and furniture offering subtle hints to the detective who could see beyond appearances. In that quiet, methodical manner, Poirot began to unravel the web of subtle disturbances at Hawthorne Estate, determined to uncover the truth behind the invisible theft. Each step, each observation, each nuance of human behavior would play a crucial role in revealing the mind of the person who dared to move unseen among treasures that were not theirs to touch. Chapter 3: A Dinner of Minds. That evening, the Hawthorne Estate exuded a quiet elegance that seemed almost tangible. The dining room was a harmonious blend of old-world grandeur and modern refinement, high ceilings adorned with ornate plasterwork, walls lined with tapestries depicting pastoral scenes, and a long mahogany table polished to a mirror-like sheen. Candlelight flickered across crystal glasses, reflecting faint prisms onto the ceiling, and the faint scent of roasted meat and fresh herbs mingled with the subtle fragrance of the roses from the adjacent garden. Poirot arrived promptly, dressed with his customary fastidiousness, dark tailored suit, immaculate tie, polished shoes, and, of course, his perfect moustache meticulously groomed. Hastings, slightly less elegant but presentable, followed, noting Poirot's calm, precise movements with admiration and mild exasperation. Lady Evelyn had invited a select group of guests for dinner, her nephew, Thomas Hawthorne, a young man of 28, sharply dressed but restless in posture, her cousin, Lady Margaret Ellison, a woman of refined age, known for her wit and discretion, and Mr. Albert Wentworth, an antiquarian of some reputation, whose keen interest in rare objects often bordered on obsessive. Poirot surveyed them carefully as he entered the room. Each movement, each gesture, each glance was meticulously recorded in the invisible ledger of his mind. "Hastings," he whispered, leaning slightly, "observe, the room is a stage, and each guest an actor. Yet even actors leave traces of true feeling, and it is these traces that reveal the hidden truths." The dinner began with polite conversation, the clinking of silverware, and the faint murmur of voices. Poirot's eyes roamed the table with subtle precision, noting Thomas's restless fingers drumming lightly against the rim of his glass, Lady Margaret's quick, almost imperceptible glances toward her nephew, and Wentworth's intense, almost feverish study of the display cabinet containing Lady Evelyn's miniatures. Poirot's attention to detail extended to the smallest motions, Thomas's slight tensing when the conversation shifted toward family possessions, the faint cough Lady Margaret emitted when her nephew spoke, and the rapid darting of Wentworth's eyes whenever Lady Evelyn mentioned the collection of miniatures. To an untrained observer, these gestures were trivial, but to Poirot, they were the very language of human intention. "The human mind," Poirot murmured to Hastings, who was struggling to keep up with the subtlety of it all, "speaks through action more than words. Note the unconscious betraying itself, mon ami. This is where we find the motives, and eventually, the culprit." As the first course was served, creamy soup accompanied by lightly toasted croutons, Poirot allowed Lady Evelyn to recount, in her own words, the precise nature of her concerns. She described the subtle alteration she had noticed in one of the miniatures, the sense that someone had handled her possessions, and her lingering anxiety over the possibility of a theft that was invisible to the unobservant eye. Poirot listened intently, nodding occasionally, his moustache quivering slightly in rhythm with his thoughts. He asked carefully measured questions, not to interrogate, but to observe reactions. "Madam," he inquired gently, "have you noticed any patterns, any repeated disturbances that might hint at who is responsible? Even the smallest detail, an object slightly shifted, a drawer not fully closed, could reveal much." Lady Evelyn shook her head, her hands twisting lightly in her lap. "No, Monsieur Poirot. That is why I am so troubled. Everything appears in place. Yet my instinct tells me that someone has been here, moving among my belongings." The conversation shifted, deliberately guided by Poirot, to topics of art, collection, and family history. Each guest responded in a manner that revealed more than mere words could convey. Thomas spoke enthusiastically about modern artistic movements, but Poirot noted the nervous tap of his foot beneath the table. Lady Margaret offered elegant and precise commentary on the Victorian miniatures, her tone smooth, almost rehearsed. Wentworth, meanwhile, leaned forward slightly whenever the conversation returned to the collection, as if measuring the room for opportunities. Poirot, employing a subtle psychological technique, allowed small lapses to occur, an intentional pause, a slight misstatement regarding a miniature's provenance, to observe the guest's reactions. Thomas flinched slightly, Lady Margaret's eyes flickered, and Wentworth's fingers tapped lightly against his glass, betraying a tension he attempted to conceal. Each small gesture added to the growing web of clues Poirot was quietly assembling. Between courses, Poirot quietly moved his attention to the table itself. He observed the placement of cutlery, the slight smudge on a napkin, even the angle of the wine glasses. "Hastings," he murmured under his breath, "each object carries a story. A careless hand leaves a trace, a careful one still leaves an impression, though one must have patience to discern it." By the time the main course of roasted pheasant with a delicate herb sauce was served, Poirot had begun formulating hypotheses. He considered motive, opportunity, and psychological inclination, the three pillars of his investigative method. Thomas had access and familiarity with the house, yet displayed impatience rather than cunning. Lady Margaret's keen intelligence could inspire subtle manipulation, but her reactions had been controlled. Wentworth, however, showed signs of intense interest in the miniatures and an almost imperceptible tension when any mention of the collection arose. Poirot continued to observe in silence, careful not to alert the guests to his scrutiny. Every sip of wine, every adjustment of a napkin, every glance toward the cabinet was recorded, catalogued, and analyzed. To Hastings, the detective's composure was almost theatrical, yet there was no performance here, only the unerring precision of observation honed over decades. Dessert, a delicate lemon soufflé, was served, along with tea, and Poirot allowed the conversation to drift toward travel, recent auctions, and social gatherings. It was during this time, he noted, that small, revealing gestures became more pronounced. Thomas excused himself abruptly, Lady Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she poured tea, and Wentworth leaned a fraction too close to inspect a decorative bowl, brushing lightly against the edge of the cabinet containing the miniatures. Poirot finally leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, moustache quivering with thoughtful satisfaction. "Hastings, you see the dance?" The criminal, even when confident, cannot suppress all the signs of tension. These little clues, these micro-movements, will guide us to the invisible hand behind the theft. Patience and observation are our allies. Before the evening concluded, Poirot requested a brief word with Lady Evelyn alone. In the soft glow of the candlelight, he asked her to recount once more any anomaly she had noticed, no matter how minor. She mentioned the slightly shifted frame of one miniature, the faint scratch on a table edge, and the subtle alignment of certain objects that seemed out of place. Poirot listened intently, nodding, filing each detail into his mind like a jeweler examining precious stones. Returning to Hastings, Poirot reflected aloud, "Hastings, the invisible theft is a clever one. The criminal believes in subtlety, in the concealment of evidence. Yet even the most cunning leaves traces, psychological, physical, or both. Our task is to perceive what is imperceptible to ordinary sight. The little grey cells must, as always, work to reveal the hidden." As the carriage returned them to their lodgings, Hastings could not resist a question. "Poirot, do you suspect any of the guests already?" Poirot's dark eyes gleamed in the dim lantern light. "Hastings, suspicion is a delicate instrument. One does not point too soon, or one risks shattering the delicate web of observation. Yet, yes, already, I have formed impressions. But impressions, Hastings, are not proof. We must continue to observe, to listen, to wait. For the criminal's confidence will, inevitably, betray itself. And so, as London streets were wrapped once more in the hush of night, Poirot retired to his lodgings, the image of the Hawthorne dining room vivid in his mind. Each gesture, each glance, each micro-expression was catalogued and analyzed. The invisible threads of the evening's interactions were being woven into a pattern only he could discern, a pattern that would, in time, reveal the mind behind the theft that had so subtly unsettled Lady Evelyn's world. Chapter 4: The Subtle Disappearance. The morning after the dinner, a gentle sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Hawthorne estate, casting a warm, honeyed glow across the polished floors. Birds chirped faintly in the garden, and the estate, from its grand facade to the smallest corner, seemed at first glance perfectly serene. Yet, beneath this calm, a small ripple of unease persisted, one that would soon become more tangible. Lady Evelyn summoned Poirot and Hastings with a mixture of urgency and distress. Her hands trembled slightly as she led them to the side cabinet in her private sitting room, the cabinet that had been the subject of much subtle observation the previous day. But this time, Poirot noticed, her eyes betrayed a deeper anxiety, one sharpened by certainty rather than suspicion. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice tight with worry, "something is missing. Or, perhaps, it has been moved. I do not know. But it is gone. A locket, an antique piece I had never even considered particularly valuable, yet priceless in memory. It was here, and now it is gone." Poirot approached the cabinet with the poise of a man who handles treasures daily, yet his eyes were alert, scanning for the invisible, the subtle, the hidden. He lifted the velvet-lined drawer, examining the interior, then traced his fingers along the edges of the wood, noting the faintest abrasion, a mark almost imperceptible, yet significant. "Ah, Hastings," he murmured, "observe. Nothing has been broken, no doors forced, no locks tampered with. Yet, the evidence of handling is here. The thief is meticulous. Almost obsessive in care. He believes he has been invisible, but the traces remain for the observant eye." Hastings frowned, still grappling with the concept. "But Poirot, how can anyone take something without leaving any real evidence? There's no sign of entry, no broken locks, nothing at all." Poirot turned, his dark eyes glinting. "Hastings, mon ami, it is precisely the cleverness of this act that makes it so dangerous. A criminal can take many things without leaving signs of violence. The evidence is not in the act itself, but in the smallest gestures, the shift of a cabinet, the slightest indentation, the polish worn in a minute corner. One must know where to look." He examined the cabinet in its entirety. The hinges, the joints, the back panel, everything was crafted with precision. Yet Poirot's keen observation detected the minute wear on the inner side of the back panel, suggesting that the locket had been extracted and replaced using a delicate mechanism. It was a theft designed to go unnoticed by anyone except someone with extraordinary powers of perception. Poirot then turned to the other objects in the room. Every trinket, every miniature painting, every small object was aligned perfectly, as if daring a careless observer to detect a disturbance. And yet, to Poirot, the subtle rearrangements were revealing. A vase slightly closer to the edge, a chair angled differently from the previous day, the faintest smudge on the polished tabletop, all whispered of a hand moving cautiously but deliberately. Lady Evelyn wrung her hands. "It is almost invisible. I feel as if the thief wishes to tease me, to unsettle me without taking anything of great value. But why? And who?" Poirot smiled faintly, stroking his moustache. "Ah, madam, the purpose of a theft is not always the object itself, but the act, the demonstration of cleverness, the temptation of curiosity, or the testing of opportunity. The motive may be knowledge, experimentation, or simple vanity. And the thief believes that, in cleverness, he is invisible. But there is no one who can entirely escape observation, n'est-ce pas? He requested to examine the room more closely, noting the exact placement of furniture, the angles of doors, the alignment of the rug, and even the faint impression of footsteps on the floor near the cabinet. He took a magnifying glass and examined the wood grain, the fine scratches, and the tiny polish residue left behind. Each observation added a piece to the puzzle, each subtle indication forming the outline of the method used by the thief. Poirot's next step was to question the household staff. Mr. Chalmers, the butler, maintained his usual composure, but Poirot noticed the slight hesitation in his voice when asked about the cabinet. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, insisted she had seen nothing unusual, but Poirot observed a faint wax smudge on her hand, a residue that suggested she had polished objects without realizing she had left a trace. "Madam," Poirot asked carefully, "do you recall if anyone visited or lingered near this room yesterday afternoon or evening?" Lady Evelyn shook her head. "No, Monsieur Poirot. Only our guests for dinner. And all of them were accounted for." Poirot nodded. "Ah, Hastings, it seems the thief may be among those we observed yesterday evening. Someone familiar with the house, someone with access and opportunity, and, importantly, someone confident enough to believe the act could go unnoticed." Hastings muttered, "But why the locket? It's hardly as valuable as the miniatures, surely." "Ah, Hastings," Poirot replied, "the object of a crime is sometimes chosen for reasons invisible to ordinary sight. Sentiment, curiosity, pride, or challenge, these are the motives that guide careful hands. Our criminal may not care for the monetary value, but for the satisfaction of performing an invisible act." Poirot then proceeded to a detailed psychological examination of the suspects. Thomas, Lady Evelyn's nephew, was young and impetuous. His restless behavior suggested a mind inclined to hasty acts rather than meticulous planning. Lady Margaret, the cousin, was intelligent and refined, yet Poirot had observed her composure and self-restraint throughout the previous evening, her reactions calculated, almost rehearsed. Wentworth, the antiquarian, however, exhibited subtle but telling signs, intense interest in the collection, slight tremors in his hands when handling objects, and a faint, almost imperceptible change in his expression whenever any mention of the miniatures arose. Poirot's mind, ever methodical, catalogued each observation with precision. "Hastings, note the psychological patterns. Thomas is impulsive, Lady Margaret restrained, and Wentworth, eager, meticulous, anxious. Each mannerism, each micro-expression, each gesture is a thread that leads us to the mind behind this invisible theft. And we must follow these threads with patience and care." He then instructed Lady Evelyn to recount the evening's events in detail, from the moment her guests arrived to their departure. She described the casual conversation, the subtle placement of objects on the table, and the seating arrangements. Poirot listened carefully, observing how Lady Evelyn spoke, noting the moments when she hesitated, the points at which her attention seemed drawn unconsciously to certain guests. By afternoon, Poirot had formed a preliminary hypothesis. The locket had been removed with care, replaced in such a way that only a trained observer could detect its absence. The act required knowledge of the house's layout, familiarity with the objects, and the confidence to manipulate them undetected. It was not a theft of opportunity, it was planned, deliberate, and subtle, a crime designed to test observation rather than force. "Mon ami," Poirot said to Hastings, "we now have a tangible act, the disappearance of the locket. Yet it is a disappearance executed with elegance and precision, revealing a mind that wishes to be clever without detection. It is, as I have said, invisible, and that is what makes it so dangerous. We must continue to watch, observe, and wait. For the thief, though confident, will reveal himself through the smallest misstep." Lady Evelyn, though relieved that Poirot acknowledged the theft, looked anxious. "But can it truly be caught, Monsieur Poirot? When nothing seems to indicate who did it?" Poirot smiled, a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "Ah, madam, the invisible is never truly invisible. It is merely unseen by the untrained eye. With observation, patience, and understanding of human nature, the traces become clear. The criminal believes himself clever, but cleverness cannot escape the scrutiny of the little grey cells." As the day waned, Poirot carefully retraced the movements within the estate, noting every detail anew, the slight scratches on the cabinet, the faint smudge on the rug, the alignment of objects previously shifted. Each observation, no matter how minute, added weight to the emerging pattern. And each pattern, Poirot knew, would ultimately point to the mind capable of executing such a subtle and audacious act. Thus, the invisible theft became visible, not through force, but through careful observation, meticulous attention to detail, and the patient unraveling of human behavior. Poirot, satisfied with the groundwork laid, prepared for the next stage of his investigation, watching, listening, and waiting for the first genuine slip of the guilty party. Chapter 5: The Gathering Storm. The Hawthorne estate had grown tense in the days following the discovery of the missing locket. What had once been a serene house of subtle elegance now felt charged with an invisible energy, as though the walls themselves were aware of a hidden drama unfolding. Hercule Poirot, ever methodical, decided that it was time to focus on the human elements of the mystery, the very minds that might conceal the subtle hand behind the theft. The morning was crisp, and a thin mist clung to the manicured gardens as Poirot and Hastings walked together toward the main house. Hastings, ever practical and somewhat impatient, voiced what he had been thinking since the discovery of the locket. "Poirot," he said, tugging at his scarf, "I still cannot understand it. Someone steals a locket, replaces it with almost no trace, and yet, you seem certain it will lead somewhere." Poirot's moustache twitched in amusement. "Ah, mon ami, the cleverness of the act is the very key to its detection. Observe, the more meticulous the thief, the more his mind betrays itself. One cannot remove something in such a precise manner without leaving behind invisible threads. Our task is to follow those threads patiently." Upon entering the house, Poirot called the household together. Lady Evelyn, anxious yet trusting, appeared first, followed by Thomas, Lady Margaret, and Mr. Albert Wentworth. Poirot greeted them politely, his movements precise and elegant, as if each gesture were a calculated part of an unseen chess game. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice calm but authoritative, "we have witnessed an unusual act, a theft invisible to the ordinary observer. Yet, to those who watch with attention, traces remain. These traces are subtle, but they speak clearly to the mind trained in observation. It is these traces I wish to examine, to understand, and to follow to their source." He first turned his attention to Thomas, the young nephew. "Thomas, tell me honestly, did you notice anything unusual during the past few days? Any movement, any conversation, any gesture that might seem odd?" Thomas shifted uneasily in his seat. I can't say I did, Poirot. Everything seemed normal to me." Poirot nodded, his eyes fixed on Thomas's hands, which twitched slightly on his knees. "Ah, but observe, Hastings. The young man's hands betray a tension he does not express in words. He is nervous, not about the theft itself, but about the possibility of suspicion falling upon him. This is typical of a mind unpracticed in subtle deception." Next, Poirot addressed Lady Margaret. Her posture was impeccable, her gaze calm, yet Poirot's trained eye noted the faint crease between her brows and the slight flutter of her eyelids as she answered. "Lady Margaret, you were present during the dinner when the guests were introduced. Did you notice anything unusual in the arrangement of the room, or in the behavior of anyone present?" Lady Margaret considered for a moment, her hands folded elegantly in her lap. "Nothing in particular, Monsieur Poirot. But I did find Wentworth's attention to the miniatures rather intense. Perhaps too intense for ordinary interest." Poirot's lips curved ever so slightly. "Ah, mon ami, precision. You see, Hastings? Lady Margaret has observed a subtle psychological nuance, a level of interest beyond casual curiosity. Such attention often accompanies opportunity and motive. Finally, Poirot turned his focus to Mr. Albert Wentworth, the antiquarian. The man's posture was rigid, his fingers intertwined, yet Poirot detected a minute tremor, almost imperceptible, in his right hand. Mr. Wentworth, you have studied antiquities for many years. Perhaps you can appreciate the value of precision in handling delicate objects. Wentworth inclined his head, clearly uncertain how to respond. Yes, of course, Monsieur Poirot. One must always be careful, very careful. Poirot's eyes glinted. Indeed. And yet, even the most careful hands leave traces. Tell me, Mr. Wentworth, have you handled any of Lady Evelyn's miniatures or trinkets recently? Wentworth's fingers tightened. I may have examined one or two, yes, but I assure you, I would never. Poirot raised a single finger, interrupting gently but decisively. We are not concerned with accusation, monsieur, but with observation. Every hand that touches an object leaves a mark, subtle or otherwise. And every mind that acts, however cautiously, reveals itself through gestures, hesitation, and attention to detail. Having assessed the initial reactions, Poirot requested to examine the cabinet once more. He noted again the delicate abrasions along the hinge and the faint fingerprint residue, comparing them mentally to the known habits and nervous gestures of each suspect. He then performed a subtle experiment, replacing one of the objects slightly off-center, observing the responses of each guest as they passed the cabinet during the course of the morning. Thomas glanced quickly but averted his eyes. Lady Margaret's attention lingered just slightly longer than propriety demanded, yet Wentworth's gaze sharpened, tracing the objects with minute, calculated interest. Poirot filed each observation meticulously. After this, he employed a psychological tactic he had perfected over decades. He allowed a small inconsistency to go unnoticed, a subtle inaccuracy in the description of a miniature's placement. The reactions were instantaneous, though nearly invisible to anyone else. Thomas twitched in mild annoyance, Lady Margaret's eyes flickered, but her composure returned quickly. Wentworth's hand moved almost imperceptibly, adjusting a nearby object, as if testing whether Poirot had observed his meticulous precision. Ah, Hastings, Poirot whispered, the threads begin to tangle. See how each mind responds to suggestion and subtle manipulation? The criminal cannot resist interacting with his environment, even in the faintest way. It is in these micro-actions that truth resides. Poirot then asked the guests to recount the sequence of the previous evening's dinner in as much detail as they could remember, not merely from memory, but including what they had observed in others, the placement of objects, the topics of conversation, and the minor adjustments of items in the room. The exercise, seemingly innocuous, revealed psychological cracks. Thomas could recall only general details. Lady Margaret recalled almost perfectly but misremembered minor sequences of physical movement, and Wentworth's account was precise but included subtle exaggerations of his own attentiveness, revealing his pride in careful observation. By the afternoon, Poirot had begun to form a clearer picture. The theft was not a simple act of opportunity, it was calculated, executed with knowledge of both the house and the objects, and committed by a mind confident in its cleverness. His analysis of gestures, minute adjustments, and psychological responses pointed toward a suspect with both access and obsession, a person whose intelligence was matched by their meticulous attention to detail. Poirot, seated by the window in quiet contemplation, spoke softly to Hastings. Hastings, the storm gathers, do you see? The criminal is clever, confident, and believes himself invisible. Yet he is already betraying himself through subtle gestures and micro-movements. The next days will reveal more. We must watch closely, observe patiently, and allow the threads to lead us to the source. Soon, the invisible will be visible, and the clever hand behind this theft will be exposed. Hastings, impressed and slightly overwhelmed, asked, "Do you really think it's one of them, Poirot?" one of the guests. "My's OUI, Hastings," Poirot replied, smiling faintly. "The evidence points clearly. But remember, suspicion is not proof. We must gather the complete picture, and the little grey cells will, in their own time, reveal the truth. One cannot rush subtlety. And subtlety, my friend, is the weapon of the careful criminal, and the tool of the careful detective." As evening fell, the atmosphere in the Hawthorne estate remained charged with unspoken tension. Guests were polite, almost unnaturally so, but under the veneer of civility, the detective perceived ripples of anxiety, curiosity, and unintentional disclosure. Each small gesture, each fleeting expression, and each adjustment of an object contributed to the growing web of clues that Poirot was unraveling, thread by delicate thread. Thus, the gathering storm was not in the weather, nor in loud confrontations, but in the silent, almost imperceptible tension of minds at play, a storm of observation, subtle manipulation, and psychological precision. And within it, Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were already assembling the intricate puzzle that would, in due course, reveal the invisible hand behind the theft at Hawthorne Estate. Chapter 6: The Red Herrings. The following morning, the Hawthorne Estate seemed to breathe an uneasy calm, as though it too were conscious of the tension residing within its walls. Hercule Poirot, always precise and deliberate, had decided that the time had come to probe more actively, to introduce minor disturbances and observe how they rippled through the household. Red herrings, carefully placed, would reveal psychological truths, and, inevitably, lead him closer to the invisible thief. Hastings, still adjusting to Poirot's abstract methods, followed him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "I confess, Poirot," he said, "I do not see how making small disturbances will help. Surely the thief would not react to such trivialities." Poirot smiled, his moustache twitching. "Hastings, mon ami, it is precisely in the smallest details that the guilty conscience trembles. The clever thief believes himself unseen, and yet every mind has a weakness, a tiny gesture, a glance, an involuntary twitch. The red herring is a tool to reveal these weaknesses. Observe, and you will see." Poirot began by placing a seemingly minor inconsistency in the sitting room. He shifted one of Lady Evelyn's miniatures slightly off-center on the cabinet shelf. To any casual observer, the movement would be almost imperceptible. To the trained eye, however, it was a signal, a test to see who noticed, who adjusted, and who reacted unconsciously. When the household assembled for morning tea, Hastings watched with amusement as Poirot observed the guests from a discreet distance. Thomas passed by the cabinet and glanced briefly at the miniature, shrugging as if unaware of the slight movement. Lady Margaret's eyes lingered on the piece for a fraction of a second longer than propriety demanded, yet she did nothing. Wentworth, however, subtly adjusted the painting with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand. Poirot's eyes lit up behind his pince-nez. "Ah, Hastings," he whispered, "observe. The clever hand cannot resist adjusting what it has long admired. The micro-movement betrays more than words could ever reveal. See how the red herring has worked, the thief's pride in precision exposes itself." Poirot then proceeded to plant another minor deception. He mentioned casually to Lady Evelyn that the locket might have been mistakenly misplaced in a different cabinet, one that was visible yet rarely used. The purpose, Poirot explained to Hastings, was twofold: to observe which guests took an unusual interest in this suggestion and to see whose curiosity might betray familiarity with the location of the missing item. Thomas, predictably, displayed little concern, his attention wandering to the garden visible through the bay window. Lady Margaret nodded politely, but her gaze remained neutral, betraying no discernible reaction. Wentworth, however, shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as if calculating the probabilities. Poirot noted every detail, from the faint tightening of Wentworth's jaw to the almost imperceptible clench of his fingers. After tea, Poirot introduced a more subtle psychological trap. He announced that the estate would be reorganized for the arrival of a visiting art historian, and that certain miniatures might need to be carefully handled or moved. This announcement, trivial to most, created a minor ripple of anxiety. Thomas, impatient by nature, barely reacted. Lady Margaret seemed mildly curious but unaffected. Wentworth, on the other hand, displayed an almost imperceptible eagerness, leaning slightly forward and adjusting his seating to observe the cabinet and its contents more closely. Poirot then orchestrated an indirect test of honesty. He requested that Hastings and Wentworth assist him in examining a small display of silver trinkets in a side room, ostensibly for cataloguing purposes. Hastings followed willingly, noting Poirot's careful attention to detail. Wentworth, however, displayed subtle signs of nervous anticipation, a faint tremor in his hand, a micro-adjustment of his clothing, and a tendency to glance repeatedly at the cabinet housing the miniatures. "Notice, Hastings," Poirot whispered, "the subtle dance of the mind under observation. The guilty conscience cannot maintain perfect stillness. Even in routine tasks, tension betrays itself in the tiniest of gestures. The red herrings are our instruments. By creating small disturbances, we allow the guilty to reveal himself, unbidden." The afternoon progressed with deliberate, almost imperceptible manipulations. Poirot shifted a velvet-lined drawer slightly, moved a silver goblet out of precise alignment, and commented casually on a minor imperfection in a miniature's frame. Each time, he observed reactions closely. Thomas showed mild curiosity but no sustained interest. Lady Margaret remained composed, eyes scanning the room politely. Wentworth, however, adjusted objects ever so slightly, his movements careful yet revealing. Poirot's observations were not limited to physical gestures alone. He noted changes in breathing, subtle facial micro-expressions, and even the cadence of speech. When Hastings commented on the light shifting across the display, Wentworth responded in a slightly higher tone than usual, betraying a tension he had attempted to mask. Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Ah, mon ami, every syllable, every intonation, is a brushstroke on the canvas of human intention. The guilty mind cannot mask itself perfectly, and the red herring is the perfect frame to reveal it." Later, Poirot arranged a casual lunch in the drawing room with Lady Evelyn and her guests. He subtly misidentified one miniature in conversation, attributing it to a different artist. Hastings, seated nearby, observed as each guest reacted. Thomas barely noticed. Lady Margaret's eyes flickered, but only for a moment. Wentworth, however, hesitated, his expression tightening as if correcting an imagined error. He then subtly leaned forward, touching a nearby cabinet edge, almost imperceptibly. Poirot's satisfaction was quiet but palpable. By evening, Poirot had gathered enough data to begin forming a clearer psychological profile. The red herrings had served their purpose. They revealed which guests were inclined to observe, adjust, and intervene, behaviors consistent with someone who had previously interacted with the missing locket. The clever manipulations had drawn subtle reactions, providing a lattice of clues upon which Poirot's deductions would rest. Poirot retired to the quiet of the estate's library, Hastings following, still a little bewildered but increasingly convinced of his friend's genius. "Hastings," Poirot said, stroking his moustache thoughtfully, "you see the effect of subtlety. The thief believes himself invisible, yet the mind cannot resist responding to carefully orchestrated stimuli. The red herrings are instruments that do not deceive the observant, they reveal." Wentworth's micro-reactions, the faint tremors, the adjustments of objects, these are the footprints of intent. Hastings leaned back in his chair, amazed. "I suppose it's clever, Poirot. But it feels almost cruel, setting these traps. What if he notices?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Mon ami, the traps are so subtle, they are invisible to the careless eye. The guilty mind cannot resist, because it thrives on control and observation. And in attempting to maintain control, the criminal leaves traces. That is the beauty of subtlety. That is the power of the little grey cells." As night fell, the Hawthorne estate resumed its quiet elegance, though under its polished surface lingered the tension of observation. Every gesture, every glance, every micro-adjustment had been catalogued by Poirot, each one a thread in the web he was slowly unraveling. The red herrings had served their purpose, to provoke reactions that revealed character, intention, and the subtle fingerprints of guilt. Poirot, in his private contemplation, allowed a faint smile to cross his features. Hastings, the invisible hand will soon make its final misstep. Each thread, each reaction, each imperceptible tremor has led us closer. Patience, observation, subtlety, these are our allies. And when the time comes, the invisible will be revealed, the red herrings discarded, and the truth exposed with the clarity of a perfectly executed deduction. Thus ended the day in which Poirot's delicate manipulations drew the invisible threads of guilt into the light, setting the stage for the final unraveling of the mystery. The stage was prepared, the actors had revealed themselves through unconscious cues, and the detective's little grey cells were ready to weave together the web of subtle clues into a definitive solution. Chapter 7: Threads of the Invisible. The morning mist clung to the Hawthorne estate once more, softening the edges of its stately architecture, yet failing to obscure the tension that had settled like a quiet fog within its walls. Hercule Poirot rose early, as was his custom, and insisted on a solitary inspection of the rooms where the locket had disappeared. Hastings, still trying to understand the subtleties of his friend's method, followed at a measured distance. Poirot's eyes scanned every surface with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The cabinet that had been the focal point of the invisible theft seemed unchanged to the untrained eye, yet to Poirot, it spoke volumes. The faint scratches along the back panel, the imperceptible polish variations, and the nearly invisible fingerprints on the velvet lining, all combined to tell a story. "Hastings," Poirot whispered, "observe. The criminal has not only touched these objects but has left a rhythm behind, a pattern of movement, careful and precise. And like all patterns, it can be interpreted. It is invisible to ordinary perception, but the little grey cells see it clearly." Hastings crouched beside the cabinet, trying to discern the details Poirot described. "It looks perfectly normal to me," he said. "How can these scratches and fingerprints indicate anything?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, Hastings, it is not merely the scratches, but their location, their frequency, and their orientation that reveal the hand behind them. Each movement, each touch, is like a word in a sentence. And the criminal's story is beginning to unfold, if only we read it carefully." Once satisfied with the cabinet, Poirot moved on to examine the other objects in the room. Every miniature, vase, and trinket was inspected with meticulous care. He noted the slightest shifts in alignment, faint traces of dust displaced, and even the subtle impressions left by repeated handling. "See, Hastings," he murmured, "even the most careful criminal leaves a trail, hidden perhaps, but present. The threads of the invisible are delicate, yet unbroken." Later that morning, Poirot convened the household for a series of subtle inquiries. He asked each member to recount, in minute detail, the sequence of events from the previous evening. Not just the actions, but the thoughts, observations, and reactions that each had experienced. Thomas, the young nephew, struggled to recall specifics. His account was scattered, full of vague impressions and overlooked gestures. Lady Margaret, precise and deliberate, recounted almost perfectly, yet Poirot detected slight embellishments, subtle corrections and micro-adjustments to the story, likely unconscious attempts to appear unremarkable. Wentworth, the antiquarian, provided a detailed and exact account, yet it contained slight exaggerations in his attention to the miniatures, revealing pride and a desire to impress. Poirot listened intently, cataloguing each gesture, pause, and inflection. "Hastings," he whispered, "observe. Each narrative reveals a thread, invisible to the casual listener but crystal clear to the observant. Note the embellishments, the omissions, the subtle tensions. These threads, when woven together, form the fabric of truth." Poirot then returned to a closer physical examination of the rooms. He compared the scratches and fingerprints on the cabinet with the patterns of movement he had observed during the red herring exercises. He noted that only one individual consistently displayed micro-adjustments that matched the type of careful handling evident in the locket's removal. The manner of touching, the precise pressure, and the deliberate gestures all pointed to a mind meticulous in both action and calculation. "Hastings," Poirot said quietly, "the criminal is not hasty. He is patient, deliberate, confident, and careful. He possesses knowledge of the house, understanding of the objects, and pride in precision. The pattern of movement, the psychological tendencies, and the small gestures all converge upon one person. We must, however, be prudent. A premature accusation could alert him." To further test his hypothesis, Poirot arranged for a private conversation with Lady Evelyn. He asked her to place the miniatures in their usual positions while he subtly altered one object out of sequence. He then observed the reactions of each household member who entered the room afterward. As expected, Thomas barely noticed. Lady Margaret's gaze lingered slightly, yet she adjusted nothing. Wentworth, however, subtly corrected the placement of the object, his movements measured but betraying an involuntary pride in precision. Poirot's lips curved slightly. "Ah, Hastings, see how the threads reveal themselves. The criminal cannot resist intervention, even when subtlety is paramount. The desire to control and perfect leaves its mark." Poirot then devised another subtle test, one designed to gauge knowledge of the missing locket's value and sentimental significance. He mentioned casually to the group that he had heard of an expert who could appraise the locket's worth. Thomas shrugged, indifferent. Lady Margaret's expression remained neutral. Wentworth, however, exhibited the faintest change, a tightening of his jaw, a micro-shift in posture, and a spark of curiosity in his eyes. Poirot filed each reaction meticulously. As afternoon waned, Poirot and Hastings retired to the library. Poirot laid out his observations in a careful sequence, threading together the physical evidence, micro-expressions, and psychological tendencies. "Hastings," he said, "observe the pattern. The scratches, fingerprints, and minute shifts in objects align with the micro-reactions we have observed. The pride in precision, the eagerness to adjust, the tension in posture, the slight tremor when attention is drawn to the miniatures, each thread independently may seem insignificant. Together, they weave a coherent pattern, pointing inexorably to the individual responsible." Hastings leaned forward, intrigued. "So, you're certain, Poirot? You can tell who did it?" Poirot's dark eyes glinted with quiet certainty. "Certain? Almost. In deduction, one must accumulate evidence, test reactions, and observe until the threads converge. We are very close. The invisible hand is revealing itself, though the final proof remains to be drawn. Patience, Hastings. Observation must precede revelation." Poirot then returned to the cabinet one final time, noting the pattern of fingerprints and polish once more. He traced the subtle wear along the edges of the drawers and panels, imagining the movements required to remove and replace the locket without detection. Each calculation in his mind aligned perfectly with the micro-reactions he had witnessed in Wentworth, the precise pressure of fingertips, the subtle tremor of pride, the attention to alignment. "The threads of the invisible," Poirot murmured, "converge at last. The methodical hand, the meticulous mind, the subtle interventions, all point toward a single consciousness. A mind that believes itself clever, yet betrays itself in the smallest acts of perfection. We are ready, Hastings, for the final observation. Soon, the invisible will be revealed." Evening fell over the estate, and Poirot arranged a final subtle test, a minor adjustment in the cabinet's display, a casual remark about the locket's significance, and the presence of a single observer to gauge reactions. The stage was set. The threads of the invisible had been traced, the psychological patterns mapped, and the physical traces catalogued. Only one mind fit every element precisely, one hand moved as the locket's removal had demanded, and one conscience trembled under subtle pressure. As the household retired for the night, Poirot remained in the sitting room, reviewing each thread, each micro-expression, each small adjustment of the objects within his meticulous mental ledger. The invisible had been observed, the subtle had been recorded, and the stage was prepared for the final unveiling. "Hastings," he said softly, "the criminal believes in invisibility, in subtlety, and in cleverness. Yet he has overlooked the power of observation, patience, and the little grey cells. Tomorrow, the threads will be drawn together, and the invisible will be made plain. The guilty mind cannot escape the scrutiny of method, for even in subtlety, perfection is impossible." Thus ended the day in which Hercule Poirot, through careful observation and patient analysis, traced the threads of the invisible, aligning physical and psychological clues into a coherent pattern that would lead, inevitably, to the revelation of the thief. The stage was prepared for the final chapter, where subtlety would meet revelation, and the invisible hand would be exposed. Chapter 8: The Invisible Revealed. The morning sun shone brightly over the Hawthorne estate, yet the warmth of the light could not chase away the tension that hung in the air. Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed as ever, had requested that the household gather in the sitting room. There was a sense of expectation, unspoken yet palpable, as Lady Evelyn, Thomas, Lady Margaret, and Mr. Wentworth assembled, each keenly aware that the detective had been observing every micro-gesture, every subtle reaction, and every seemingly inconsequential action for days. Poirot stood with his hands clasped behind his back, moustache perfectly groomed, eyes dark and focused. He gestured gently for all to sit. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, in his calm, deliberate tone, "we are here to conclude the investigation of a matter most subtle, a theft invisible to the ordinary eye, yet present to the patient observer. I thank you for your cooperation and, indeed, for the unwitting contributions each of you has made." Hastings, sitting beside Poirot, whispered nervously, "Do you think one of them will admit it, Poirot?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, Hastings, confession is rarely immediate. Truth, however, cannot remain hidden when the threads are pulled carefully. Today, we shall see the invisible made visible." Poirot began with the physical evidence, recounting each subtle clue he had observed. He described the cabinet where the locket had been taken, noting the slight abrasions along the inner panel, the delicate fingerprints on the velvet lining, and the imperceptible Polish differences. "Observe," he said, pointing to the cabinet, "the hand that removed the locket did so with precision, care, and confidence. No lock was broken. No object was damaged. The criminal believed himself invisible." He then moved to the psychological observations, which were the most revealing. "Yet, Miss Amos, even the most careful mind cannot conceal its pride, cannot suppress the unconscious movements that betray intention. Micro-adjustments of objects, subtle gestures, a tremor of hands, a tightening of the jaw, a glance too long, a syllable spoken in slightly elevated tone, all these are witnesses to the mind at work. It is here, not in the stolen object itself, that the truth resides." Poirot paused, letting his words settle like a soft weight in the room. Then he recounted the experiments, the red herrings, the subtle adjustments he had made, the deliberate inconsistencies he had introduced. He detailed how each guest had reacted: Thomas, restless and indifferent; Lady Margaret, precise yet controlled; Wentworth, meticulous and subtly overeager in his interventions. "Now," Poirot continued, "we come to the convergence of these threads. The scratches on the cabinet match the manner of handling displayed by a mind accustomed to careful precision. The fingerprints correspond to those seen when subtle adjustments were made. The psychological patterns, reaction to minor disturbances, response to suggested misplacements, micro-movements of pride, all point in one direction." He leaned slightly forward, his dark eyes sweeping the room. "The guilty party is one who possesses knowledge of the estate, understanding of delicate objects, meticulous attention to detail, and pride in precision. One who cannot resist adjusting what is out of place, even slightly. One whose mind thrives on cleverness and subtlety. A faint hush fell over the room. Wentworth shifted in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly, yet attempting to maintain composure. Thomas and Lady Margaret exchanged glances, their expressions calm but attentive. Poirot's lips curled faintly. It is curious, is it not? That those who take pride in their meticulousness cannot help but betray themselves in the smallest of actions. And it is precisely this pride that exposes them. Poirot then drew together the final pieces of his reasoning. Consider the timeline, Miss Amos. The locket disappeared without force, yet the cabinet shows evidence of careful handling. The movements required to remove and replace the object align perfectly with the micro-reactions observed in one individual during the subtle tests. Furthermore, the psychological profile, the need to control, the attention to detail, the micro-adjustments is consistent with the observed behaviors of a mind confident in its cleverness. Only one person fits all these criteria. He paused dramatically, allowing the words to settle like a weight over the room. Mr. Albert Wentworth, he said, pointing gently yet unmistakably, you are the person responsible for the removal of the locket. Your knowledge of delicate objects, your meticulous handling, and your unconscious pride betrayed you repeatedly. Every subtle movement, every imperceptible adjustment, every micro-expression led us inexorably to you. Wentworth's eyes widened slightly, a flash of alarm crossing his carefully controlled face. He opened his mouth, then closed it, a brief tremor in his hand betraying his inner agitation. Poirot continued, calm and precise. You believed that by moving the locket without detection, by leaving no signs of forced entry, you had created the perfect invisible act. Yet perfection is impossible. Even the most careful hand leaves traces, and the mind cannot suppress its reactions. You have left a trail, subtle yet unbroken, that could be traced by patient observation. Wentworth's composure faltered. I did not mean harm, he stammered. I only wished to examine it, to understand its construction. I thought it would go unnoticed. Poirot inclined his head, expression serene. Ah, monsieur, intent matters little when actions disrupt another's peace. Yet your behavior explains the pattern of movement, the subtle adjustments, the meticulous handling. It is a lesson in psychology as much as in detection. Pride in cleverness is the undoing of the careful criminal. Lady Evelyn, though shocked, spoke gently. Albert, you frightened me. I never suspected. Poirot raised a finger to silence any expressions of emotion, his focus entirely on the deduction itself. Observe, Miss Amos, that the invisible is never truly invisible. It is simply unnoticed by those untrained in observation. The little grey cells, working patiently, can unravel even the most delicate and precise acts. Today, we see clearly what was intended to remain unseen. He then explained, step by step, how the locket had been removed. The cabinet's rear panel had been slightly manipulated, the object lifted with careful fingers, and subtle micro-movements ensured that no immediate suspicion arose. Each red herring had been designed to provoke a reaction, to reveal the pride and meticulousness that Wentworth could not entirely conceal. Every micro-expression, every subtle tremor, every minor adjustment of objects had been catalogued and interpreted to identify the criminal. Hastings, leaning forward, whispered, "Brilliant, Poirot. You traced invisible threads to reveal the truth." Poirot nodded, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Exactment, Hastings. The clever criminal believes himself hidden, yet the mind cannot remain silent. In intention, in gesture, in pride, the truth speaks. And today, the invisible has been revealed. Wentworth, now pale and subdued, handed the locket back to Lady Evelyn. She accepted it with a mixture of relief and gentle reproach. Poirot's gaze swept the room one final time. Let this serve as a lesson, Miss Amos. Careful observation, patience, and the study of human nature are the greatest tools of detection. The smallest gestures, the tiniest reactions, the subtlest micro-expressions, these are the footprints of truth, invisible to all but the observant mind. With that, the tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a sense of resolution. The invisible act, executed with pride and precision, had been exposed, and the intricate web of subtle clues had been untangled by the patient and meticulous reasoning of Hercule Poirot. As Poirot and Hastings departed the estate, Hastings asked, "Poirot, it never ceases to amaze me. How do you see so much in what seems invisible?" Poirot's dark eyes twinkled. "Hastings, the world is never invisible, it is simply unnoticed. Observation, patience, and understanding of human nature reveal what others cannot perceive. Even in subtlety, the truth exists, waiting for the little grey cells to find it." And so, the Hawthorne estate returned to its quiet elegance, the invisible threads now clearly revealed, the mystery resolved, and the clever criminal humbled by the unerring precision of Hercule Poirot's methodical mind.